Opening the center's diagonal immediately aims for swift development and potential attacking opportunities. Preparing a robust pawn chain for queenside expansion, this defense immediately challenges central control. Dominating the center, white immediately claims space and opens lines for their pieces, aiming for rapid development. Challenging the center immediately, this pawn advance ignites a dynamic struggle for central control and opens lines for immediate piece activity. Carving out central space, this pawn advance immediately cramps black's queenside, demanding a careful repositioning of their pieces to maintain flexibility. Challenging the center immediately, c5 aggressively contests the d4 pawn and opens lines for piece development. Opening a central diagonal for the queen, this pawn snatch frees up queenside space. Developing the knight here immediately pressures the pawn on c5, aiming for active piece play. Leveraging the pinned knight, this bishop aims to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain control of key diagonals. This pawn sacrifice opens crucial diagonals for black's bishops and activates the queen, creating dynamic counterplay. Asserting control over the d4 square, this piece bolsters the pawn structure and prepares for a potential kingside initiative. Unleashing the queen forces a redirection of white's bishop, momentarily disrupting development and creating an open path for counterplay. Securing the knight offers central influence and prepares for pawn recapture, bolstering white's positional hold. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to recapture the sacrificed pawn sets up a balanced middle game fight. Developing the knight to f3 supports the central pawn structure and prepares for kingside castling, aiming for rapid kingside development. Developing the knight towards the center aims to solidify black's pawn structure and prepare for an eventual queenside expansion. Securing the queenside pawn structure is the immediate goal, but it invites further development for black. Shifting the queen to c7 prepares for queenside development and potentially supports a queenside pawn push, while keeping an eye on white's bishop pair. Expanding pawn presence on the queenside aims to restrict black's pieces and potentially create attacking chances. The knight seeks a less congested outpost, aiming to reposition for queenside pressure and potentially support the central pawn push. Sacrificing material to disrupt black's pawn structure and open lines creates a sharp imbalance. Doubling pawns on the c-file might seem like a concession, but it unlocks the b-file for potential counterplay and opens lines for your bishops. Securing the central advance, this bishop now eyes weaknesses on the queenside and reinforces the d4 square. Unlocking the queen's rook pawn with this advance, black aims to create counterplay on the queenside, though it weakens the kingside pawn structure considerably. Unlocking the d-file opens a swift assault on black's exposed monarch. Opening the g-file fundamentally alters the king's safety, creating long-term exposure. Unleashing the bishop opens attacking lines towards black's weakened kingside pawn structure. Instigating a counterattack along the g-file, black seeks to exploit white's doubled pawns and open lines towards the king. Seizing the open files, this offers aggressive play and immediately pressures black's vulnerable king. Acknowledging the threat, this retreats the bishop, seeking a safer haven while preserving its attacking potential for later. Eliminating that knight opens crucial diagonal lines for your rook to penetrate, exploiting black's exposed king. Exposing the monarch to the center dramatically escalates the risk of a swift mating attack. Unleashing a dual purpose, castling long fortifies the king while opening the h-file for potential rook activity. Reclaiming the central file with the rook initiates a potent counterattack, targeting white's potentially exposed monarch. Opening the central file now offers white a direct assault on black's exposed monarch. Unleashing a desperate check, black desperately seeks counterplay, hoping to disrupt white's emerging dominance. Recapturing with the queen untangles white's pieces, preparing to contest the central files and exploit black's exposed king. Securing the king in the center presents a significant risk, potentially exposing it to further harassment. This knight repositions to a more active square, eyeing central control and potential breakthroughs. Trading queens here simplifies the position, handing black a clear advantage in king's safety. A necessary pawn recapture, opening the f-file for the rook while solidifying the central structure and setting up a potential kingside attack. Relocating the king to c7 abandons the protection of the d7 pawn, opening a new avenue for white's rook. Opening the e-file creates immediate pressure, aiming to exploit black's vulnerable king. Reclaiming central space with this pawn push immediately challenges white's advanced soldier and opens critical diagonals for black's queenside. Re-establishing central influence, the knight prepares to redeploy to a more active square, aiming to support the pawn advance and potentially restrict black's undeveloped pieces. The knight's detour to the flank aims to disrupt white's central control and potentially threaten the weak kingside pawn structure. Reclaiming central influence with the knight solidifies white's structure and prepares for potential queenside expansion. Boldly sacrificing a knight to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines against the king creates dynamic counterplay. Liberating the rook to control open files is the priority now, aiming to exploit black's exposed king. Unleashing pressure down the open file, this piece eyes the vulnerable enemy king. Securing that open file is paramount, controlling the crucial d-square. Reclaiming central space and threatening white's advanced knight seems the immediate priority. Securing the d-file offers a vital pathway for the rook, aiming to challenge black's exposed king. Sacrificing the rook to clear the central file and open a path for your king's active participation is a bold endgame gamble. Unlocking the kingside now, the white monarch steps into the fray, seeking active central influence. Reactivating the rook on the open f-file shores up black's control and prepares for potential counterplay. Seizing the initiative by activating the knight, aiming to exploit the weakened kingside and centralize. The bishop's redeployment to e8 prepares a crucial defensive screen, aiming to shield the king and potentially launch a counter-initiative. Reclaiming the open diagonal for the bishop offers a surprising counter-initiative, disrupting black's pawn structure. Unburdening the knight from its defensive post opens lines, but risks leaving the king exposed to further analysis. King exposure intensifies as your monarch steps into potential danger on the weakened kingside. A desperate attempt to activate the rook, hoping to disrupt white's clean pawn structure. Securing the king's flank allows for potential pawn advances and activates the king for the endgame. Shifting the rook to the 5th rank unifies the remaining pieces for a potential breakthrough. Shifting the knight to target the isolated e4 pawn creates immediate pressure. The rook's repositioning aims to contest the central files, though it does open avenues for white's remaining pieces. Redirecting attack to the kingside, exploiting the open file and the misplaced bishop. The rook now vacates the 8th rank, potentially preparing for a flank maneuver, though its current position feels somewhat passive. Asserting control of the open files, this rook aims to disrupt black's coordination. Shifting the king offers respite, but neglects the open f-file's peril. Challenging the pinned knight forces a difficult decision for black, potentially opening a critical file. Relocating the monarch from the dangerous central files into a safer haven on the kingside is a sensible defensive maneuver. Shifting the rook to the open file initiates a promising attack on black's exposed monarch. The rook retreats, preparing to double on the g-file and pressure white's exposed king. Boldly confronting the opposition's rook, this king maneuver prepares to reactivate the central pawns and support an advance. This king hunt has created an imbalanced structure, offering the rook an inviting open path to the 2nd rank. Forcing a king away from the protective pawn shield and into open lines. Relocating the king toward the center opens up crucial escape routes and prepares for potential king activity in the endgame. A forcing check that disrupts black's king's precarious sanctuary. The captured bishop ends white's initiative, opening lines for black's rooks to become active. Simplifying to a winning rook endgame, leveraging your active king and centralized rook. Sacrificing the rook for central pawn control creates a dynamic endgame where black's exposed king faces immediate pressure. Securing the advanced pawn establishes a dangerous outpost for the rook, threatening further incursions into black's weakened territory. Grabbing that pawn creates a passed pawn for white and simplifies the position. Asserting dominion over the c-file, this rook aims to pierce the queenside's defenses. The king boldly ventures forward, seeking active participation in the endgame's unfolding drama. Activating the king is paramount now to support the rook and potentially disrupt black's coordinated pieces. Threatening the king with checks is the only way to disrupt white's encroaching pawns and aim for a draw. King hunts often expose weaknesses. Now white's monarch must navigate a minefield of activity. Seeking to exploit the open files, black pushes the king further into the open, hoping for a decisive check. Protecting the king from further checks, white consolidates the queenside while setting up a potential rook lift. A desperate king hunt continues, seeking an escape before the pawn rush seals black's fate. Protecting the king and securing the queenside advance with an eye toward pawn promotion. The king cautiously retreats, seeking sanctuary from the looming rook's pressure. Forcing the black king to move again, this check aims to exploit the open files and gain further positional advantage. King exposure is critical. Black's monarch is now directly targeted by the rook's assault. Securing the central control with the rook prevents any counterplay and solidifies the advantage. The rook on h8 now supports a potential infiltration on the king side or adds defensive pressure. This king's perilous wanderings create a dangerous outpost for the rook, potentially leading to a swift checkmate. Exploiting the exposed king's position by forcing the rook onto the open file is the immediate objective now. This endgame is a race to promote, and white's king is now actively pursuing black's scattered pawns. Unleashing the central pawn now promises to disrupt white's neatly arranged pieces and potentially create new attacking avenues. King captures a pawn, simplifying into a winning endgame with clear pawn structure advantages. A bold attempt to regain material by capturing the pawn, but it overlooks the imminent threat of white's rook. Pressing the queenside pawns forward opens pathways for the king's infiltration. This pawn sacrifice opens lines, but leaves the king exposed to a powerful discovered check. Pushing the pawn forward creates immediate queenside space, a vital asset for the approaching endgame. Suddenly, a desperate check reveals the exposed white king, forcing an immediate reaction. The king's exposed position now invites decisive complications. A desperate attempt to complicate matters, but the pawn structure is too broken to offer real counterplay. Securing the pawn chain with this advance attempts to prevent black's rook from invading further and solidifies white's advantage. Sacrificing material to expose the enemy monarch is a bold gambit, potentially a turning point. The king bravely steps forward, seeking refuge from the relentless pawns while eyeing the enemy's exposed monarch. The black king's excursion to c5 opens a dangerous diagonal for white's rook. Propelling the pawn forward creates a looming threat that black will struggle to contain.